check on some things for a minute just to make sure. Okay, so it's able to see through the screen. I want to make sure if it's able to pop up on YouTube. Okay, it seems to be going through just fine. All right, that's excellent. All right. Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and I really need to work on making a screen where it's like, the stream is starting and then the music plays. I don't know if I really should be playing copyrighted music in these live streams or not, but I mean, that's going to be a thing for the future. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of seeing through the Zoojitos background, but that doesn't matter. We'll give it about a few more minutes and then we'll get started with what I'm about to go through for today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the mic for just a moment and I'll be back. Okay, so it's reconnecting right now. So the desktop's Wi-Fi is a little bit scuffed right now. My laptop, actually, hold on. So my laptop and phone are working just fine with the internet connection, but it's just my computer's Wi-Fi adapter's a little bit scuffed right now. But hopefully that shouldn't affect too much as far as how things are going to be run through the stream. So it looks like it's going pretty good right now. Okay, so about a couple more minutes, but I can just go ahead and discuss what we're going to be getting into for today's live stream. I did mention that I was going to go over a retrospective on one of my projects that I have been working on for almost 5 years at this point. And I'll be discussing some details that probably haven't even touched upon that much. At least when it comes to my writing episodes and other stuff that I have been trying to patch out before I get to the final product. Okay, about 1 minute, so I can go ahead and get started. Any of you are welcome to join in. I'm actually going to go ahead and share this with or a couple Discord servers. So give me just a moment. Go ahead and post this over here. I know I have root, but I don't have. I mean, I do have Fluxer installed onto my laptop, but not on this desktop. So I'll go ahead and get this into a few servers. It's not going to be a whole lot, but your own videos. And of course, OBS is being a bit of a, being really difficult right now. Okay, so I guess whoever's going to be joining in will be joining in. So I'll go ahead and get things started from here. So first of all, welcome to this live stream. I'm Obscure Titan of this YouTube channel, and I'm going to be going over a retrospective on Megatronic Legacy. My most recent project series that I've been working on, apart from Zoojitos, that is still currently in development, and this is going to be the only, this is currently the only project that is up and going. Now, if you've known me for like since 2019, maybe even beyond that, oftentimes do kind of like a multi-fandom projects that are sometimes in the mix of a Mortal Kombat theme, and sometimes it could be more of a legacy or semi-politic kind of theme that goes onto it. And it's kind of goes at different directions, but the previous work that I've done before going into Megatronic Legacy were both Mortal Brothers 2019 and the Zenectic Legend series. So the Zenectic Legend series was an original project work that I have done back in 2018, late 2018 I should say, and then going all throughout 2019 and then somewhere in 2020 to 2021. Pretty much the same deal with Mortal Brothers 2019, although that has been in a slightly longer production than what the Zenectic Legend had initially. And if you have seen any of the chapters or episodes of the Mortal Brothers 2019 videos that I have done back in 2019, working on the series in particular, I had something new coming up that would eventually take over after Mortal Brothers 2019 was finished. And so I will be going ahead, and if I can find it, I will be presenting some of the ideas that I have done all the way back in 2021 and just kind of go from there. So, and not everything's going to be in order, and hopefully I should be able to find that one thing in particular. Come on, let's find out real quick, because I know I have that one other piece that I should have included. The one piece I wanted to showcase was the title of the series. So if I can go ahead and copy and paste it over to my hard drive, because I'm using that to work on projects from there instead of my C drive. The problem with having to work on the C drive is that the C drive is much easier to screw up than any other hard drives, because if it's just a hard drive, provided if you're able to copy and paste all the other stuff into other hard drives, you should be fine and still use the computer. But if anything happens to your C drive, then it's screwed over and you're not going to be able to work from there. I didn't think so at first until I finished up a class from Full Sail University where they would urge you to use a D drive or anything that is not a C drive. It's kind of an industry thing, and I just rather just keep working on that from there just to keep that mindset. And it's also a good workflow just to make sure that none of your stuff gets screwed over. I mean, there's also the OneDrive, but I'm not trusting cloud storage to keep my stuff in case if their servers go down. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and just going to go through some of the concepts, and not everything's going to be set in order. I'm going to try to, but I want to try to keep things as, chronologically consistent as I can. So this is how everything all started out. And this was back on August, not really a fantasy kind of feel, but it just kind of has more of that heavy metal look to that. And a couple of icons that I've worked on for the series initially, it was going to be kind of like a pentagram Decepticon emblem, and another one that has Megatron with the fangs that are added onto that. So it's going to get a bit more of kind of that cool look to that. Some might say it's kind of an edgy look to that, which admittedly it does. Imagine if Megatron was way too high on dark energon drugs and then he just went completely vampire. So yeah, that's what it was initially. The first character that I can recall that has had his concept started would be Spyro the Dragon. So Spyro was the first character that I tried out, including for the concepts. The inspiration that I got from this character was having to use Charlie Barkin and Littlefoot just to kind of get that design feel, and also kind of go for more of a pseudo Don Bluth Disney anime-esque type of art style that I've been kind of experimenting and tried out for all the other characters that will appear in this. And then I've added some of those bumps around him. It kind of gets more of a because some of the reptile characters would have details on them. And then also that face, I kind of structured that from Charlie Barkin to kind of get that look, kind of that dog-like look for Spyro, while still getting much of that from the classic Spyro look from the PS1, as well as Reignited. And I also added in some gills to his neck. What I was going for a lot of the dragons for this project was that they were going to be kind of a cheese, where they can breathe underwater as well as being able to breathe in the air. And I even had the idea of the dragons being able to breathe in space. I know that's a bit of a crazy concept for species like that to be able to exist in space, considering that there's not really any oxygen going on in space. And it's, from what I can tell, it's not a very good experience having to live in space without that oxygen. But I had that idea where they can breathe in space, and there's that expression that I gave to Spyro as well as the tail. I kind of like the idea of giving the dragons the ability to be able to breathe in space where they can be able to venture out and about. That never really materialized though, so that's more kind of an unanswered theory, I suppose. And so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one. So I think I might be jumping all over the place in some of these things, but here's one where I tried designing some titles for the series where I have Dragon Refugee, which end up becoming Norkarchy, then Velvet Retaliation, and then we would have Shiai Ryu Crusader, which would end up becoming Akuma. So I'll touch a little bit more on Velvet Retaliation in a bit, but you can tell from those letters that it was going to have its own alphabet, or kind of like its own language. And here's an early design of Ripto, kind of going for that reignited look for the guy, before I ended up giving him that alligator or crocodile look to his snout. And some designs that I did of Megatron is that I was going to go for more of a Transformers Prime look to the character, as well as giving him the fusion cannons that would add up to his arm, or mounted at his arm, I should say. A lot of the concepts that I did exploring Megatron's design for the series was giving him this pentagram type of chest piece that's going on, added onto him. Because much of that I was exploring some of the darker themes, and some of the religious or non-religious imagery to kind of add on to some of the characters. So the first concept is much closer to the TFP in some cases of, or maybe the Bayverse. I don't know if I would say Bayverse, but it's sort of in between those. Okay, I think next one. All right, so the next one is the alphabet that I was mentioning earlier. I didn't get all those in because a lot of the stuff that I tried to get in, I was a little too late to get those in, but I had to scan them through from my sketchbook. So the alphabet that I was experimenting on was kind of going into what the series was going to have when the characters are talking. So imagine if you had Megaterror or even Savior, where the Cybertronian characters would talk in this language. I would kind of imagine them kind of saying this kind of language. So, for example, if they were to say Etna, they would have said Okgo. Or Velvet, it would have been Disarcdirk. Or maybe with Norkarchy, it could have been like Pegyons Som Sarko. So you can kind of see where the problem was going on when I tried to experiment with the way the characters, or the characters with this language, are going to talk, because it's very convoluted to be able to talk through with this type of pronunciation or language to kind of speak through. And I've been experimenting with some of the languages such as German or Russian, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and some of the other language I experimented with, even Greek, where I wanted to kind of experiment what kind of languages that would be able to fit with the type of feel that the series was going through. Now, going a little bit off topic here, I did experiment with the languages for Zujitos, although that's a little bit more limited, mainly with Chinese, Korean, and Turkish, maybe even Japanese to some extent. But I kind of try to keep that to a limit because I want to see where that all be able to fit in. I would argue that Zuji, either the USSR or if he was going to be experimented by some kind of. There was a little bit of a scuff that's going on with my live stream, but yeah. Again, my desktop's Wi-Fi connector is a little bit scuffed, so excuse me on that one, but yeah. Anyway, so either it was going to be the USSR or it was going to be some kind of other country to create Godzilla. That's what it was going to be. Now, I did initially thought of having him be connected to the 1954 Godzilla because that's pretty much where all things kind of started out with Godzilla. It always had to be the 1954 film. But ever since Godzilla -1 came out, and that was back in December of 2023, that ended up being changed to having Godzilla -1 being canon instead of the 1954 film. Now, admittedly, the 1954 film, before the change happened, it was very ambiguous and it was difficult to tell if it had any connection to the series before it delved deeper, since Kami-Phasma Part 1 and 2. So there wasn't really as much of a concern as it was more kind of like a minor change that was a little bit of an inconvenience at worst. But so I went for a kind of a mix of a 98 Godzilla, Ultima, and I think GMK, primarily GMK because of the light eyes that he was going to have, which ended up being materialized. But some of the other different ideas that I ended up changing that we're about to see later on, that was quite different from what we're seeing here in this concept art. And he was going to be slightly smaller than Zenectic Godzilla. So not even so much of a matrix design, but more kind of like a sickle hammer type of design for the Dark Spark. Now, Velvet initially had like a cape that's kind of wrapped around her with a blade, as well as kind of like a gauntlet on her left arm. Now, the Arbiter's design has pretty much been finalized at that time. Velvet's wasn't finalized, at least not initially, when designing the character. No, skipping past that one because I've already gone through that. Velvet Retaliation, in terms of the title, has been the only one in the series that pretty much stayed finalized, while everything else has had to change. So the idea for that storyline in particular was going to be a conflict between the Covenant Union, which ended up becoming the Unicronic Covenant Democracy Union, and then you have the kind of like the Wiccan faction led by Etna and her minions to be able to track down the remains of Megatron and resurrect him. And another character that would be added on to the mix was Laharo. This Laharo was going to be more kind of like the Xeno Laharo. So if you've played some of the Disgaea games, or at least one of them that featured Xeno Laharo, how the Xeno characters worked in Disgaea is that they're like the opposites of the official characters. So if you've seen Laharo in his initial or his official look, kind of like the selfish, bratty type of character, the Xeno Laharo is the opposite, where he's a pretty good boy. He's just a heroic type of character, and not like the bratty kid that's going around claiming to be the like what I was going for with this Laharo is supposed to be the heroic type of character in this iteration. Unfortunately, Laharo had to get let go from the series. There wasn't really any place for him to be in the series. There were some Disgaea characters that were considered for the series, before concepts were being made. Apart from Laharo, there were some ideas for Kilia, there were some for Valvatoris, I think maybe even Seraphina and Red Magnus. None of them have been approved into the final product, unfortunately. Because as it is right now, the only characters that seem to be finalized, apart from Axel Zeus, which is kind of more of a pseudo Axel and Nitro Zeus, the two characters that did make it in were Flan and Etna. Skipping over here. So I did some concept work for Metalhead and Dr. Shemp. Now, while Dr. Shemp still remained the same as it was in terms of design, Metalhead had to go through another design change. where instead of looking like some kind of a big mech where he has claws and just has these big pieces for some reason, he would come closer to how his original design was in 1998 and maybe even 2018 with Reignited. I would argue that I would say that the Megatronic look is closer to that of Reignited than the classic version. Okay, so there is an unfinished look for Nestor. Skipping over here, Crash Bandicoot and Starscream. Starscream, another character that would have his design finalized later down the lines, but Crash, it's debated if he was going to appear in this or not. I even have ideas of him appearing in the final act of the series, which is the Retribution and Nibiru Crisis 3 would be taking place, but that's kind of up in the air if that's ever going to happen. Now, Starscream, as he is, still remains the same as it was from initially, apart from removing these letters off of the wings. Now, the Zurg, the only change that had to happen later down the line, this is even after his final concept was done, was just removing the tube that comes from his back. So, and good thing that the tube had to get removed off of his gun. The reason for that is, one, it's going to be easier to animate with Zurg, Senator Zurg, I should say. And then lastly, it would have looked more appealing from his design with the cape than just having some kind of plug to his back. Also, it would have made sense for him to not have like a pack that's on his back and just going to have everything just be on his gun alone. Okay, there's Missilika, Empress Missilika, who is one of the prominent antagonists and villains for the Megatronic Legacy series. So much of her design is much the same as it was. The only changes that it had to go through, and this is even when working with some of the artists on Twitter or Discord, where I had to get commissions, where I got commissions from them, and some of the design changes that happened had to do with the shoulder pads, as well as with how the wings are designed. Now, it was supposed to, the wing tips were supposed to have like an angular type of bones to them, where it's just kind of like this, where I'm kind of just hovering over. Now it just seems like one small streak of metal or type of bone that kind of goes up instead of having like an angular look. So I ended up having to make the change to where it would match along with what the artists have done. Admittedly, I'm one of those people that's more willing to make those changes just based off of whose artists I've worked on, just to kind of get those changes to work. That's just kind of me. All right, let's see, anything else? And I think there's some with Magilu and there's Grimoire. So they would end up appearing in the series, maybe not in the same way as how I initially thought it was going to be. So Magilu was going to have more kind of a mix of Jinx and for those of you who don't know, it's Jinx from Teen Titans. And I think some part of that, I can't exactly remember whose character it was, but it was primarily Jinx from Teen Titans that I got the inspiration from the design. So I was initially going to have OBS. Oh no, that's not the stripes. There were some. I'm going to go ahead and open that up just to kind of compare. Here's the final design of her, and then here's her legging. It was going to have these patterns, but that ended up just being these purple lines that are going on the outlines. There were going to be these pins that were going to attach to her dress, but that got dropped in the final version. And then her hair. Now, I don't think you're able to see that going on from the back. There were some changes that had to go on just to make sure that the design was making sense based on how I was able to animate it. She would get these little hairpins that would just kind of tie up in between them, kind of like Jasmine from Aladdin, in a way. Okay, so that should pretty much be that for Magilu. Let's get right back into some of the other concepts from 2021. So the language, there it is. I think this is already shown off more here. I've got some numbers that I've been working with just to kind of see how they would look. So I tried to get some inspiration off of the Roman numerals just to kind of see how they would look based off of what kind of designs that I've been working with. And then skipping over here, I think some of the stuff is just some mapping stuff. You're not able to see it as well. Let me skip over to Mystica. So some concepts that I've worked on, at least for one of them, was kind of going for kind of a mixture of Spyro 2's Avalar and Riptonia. Well, that would have been Riptonia if Spyro didn't defeat Ripto. But I did a kind of create a hell that's inspired from Dante's Inferno. Now, of course, the difference being is that it's a giant asteroid, which is about 3 times the size of Earth. And that would have a very different type of structure where instead of hell taking place inside the Earth, where Satan is inside the center of the Earth, it would be an asteroid where it would be all the way from the top where Limbo would be, and then all the way to the bottom tip of the asteroid where Treachery would end up being located. So it's a very different iteration of hell in that sense. And then there's the universe itself, Helrix, then there's Metrospherus, there's Cybertron, Earth, and pretty much all that. Now, with the Genie realm or the Tridimension domain, it would end up becoming the very top of Helrix, where they would pretty much keep that realm in place where it prevents demons from having to escape. So the idea for the Genie realm being attached to the sword that's being pierced into Helrix was that genies were supposed to keep these demons and fallen Cybertronians from fleeing Helrix. And Mystica, I know this is not the true size for what this concept is looking. It's supposed to look slightly smaller than the Earth, but it would be a lot smaller than Helrix. And it would presumably be smaller than the Genie realm. So there's Unicron right here. So a part of the design that I was going for based off of how 10 levels of heaven were. It's like going from the moon to, I can't exactly remember what the order of the rings were or what the order of spheres were going to be in heaven. But that's what Unicron would take. And then the upper half, which is where Cybertron would be taking. And then there's another concept of Helrix with Cybertron and the Halo rings, or the Halo factories, I should say. Another concept of Helrix. So a very similar structure to what Hell was depicted in Inferno. And then here's another concept of Ripto, which would end up becoming finalized. So we don't see him having a book with him, but we do get to see the amulet that he wears around his neck, which is supposed to be Mesolika emblem, and then his scepter. That unfortunately he lost to Gulp. So there's that. Okay, there's some concepts of Plink. Now she would have a much smaller role in the series, and this was supposed to be for the Mortal Brothers 2019 saga, but since that series was already coming to a close, and that she would already have a different design anyways, so I ended up playing with some design bits where she would have like a crescent moon that's going all the way up, and then she would have her gloves and then her sleeves and have this little hairpin. So if you've played Seven Sirens, she would have these hairpins to her pigtails that would act as another set of eyes. And then I would add up a eye design where she would have an insignia inside, that's being covered by her hair, and then that would be on Conquer. Now, this is definitely not the first time that I have added Conquer into a project that I've been working on. He's definitely appeared in the Great Unicron Legacy from early 2010s when I did the plush stop motion series at the time. And he's definitely made a comeback for this. I was kind of giving him more kind of like kind of like a nationalist, anti-communist agent, where he would be spying on other countries, where he would give intel to America. So that was part of the idea that I was going for the character. Now, Zapple was originally going to appear in the series, and much of the design would be the same as it was from the 2019 or Warner Brothers 2019 saga. Now, she would go through some changes with her design, and she would end up getting a princess design up until later in production. She would end up getting dropped, in favor of Vera and Plink being in, arguably more so for Vera, who gets a bigger role in it.
And so there's that for. I think they're supposed to. Do I have some more?
Okay, so that will go back to the title that I've already showcased. Okay, so let me go a little bit back further. There's some concepts of Flan. I was going for something similar to what I had with the TGEOL, the Great Unicron Legacy design of Flan, where it's kind of like the Winry daughter type of character that I had at the time. And so I was also utilizing some of the robotic or biomechanical bits to her design. Also going through some different bionicle designs for her wings as well as for her bow and arrow. And I would still keep the skirt design that I had, which that in itself was a very big nightmare for me to work with in animation, because I try to work on getting some skirt designs. I just don't make skirt designs like this as much as I do with the pants. But some bits of the design, such as the bow and the long hair, the eyes, pretty much everything I added on to this character. Okay, and so what I was going for in terms of storyline is I would kind of have a timeline where there are some films that would take place in the same time as some other films would. So, for example, if Velvet Retaliation and Nasty Devastation or Norkarchy, we'll say, that would take place in the same year and the same month as 1983. That's the kind of idea that I tried to go for at the time. And some storylines would have to be connected to specific arcs that would be connected to. So for Bandicoot Mayhem, it would specifically be connected to Dingo Business. It wouldn't have any connection to other storylines. It could end up adding up to later films, but that further complicated things, and that's kind of why I decided to make a change with how things were being written down, where it would just have to be one film and then going into another. So kind of like a point A to point B type of thing. It's not like here's like point 1, point 2, point 3. Now it's connected to point 4, point 5. It's just a very convoluted mess. I tried to go for something like this. It just didn't work out the way that I was hoping for. Now, you can also see that based off of the color that I used, the green was going to be for the bigger films, and the purple or the pink ones are the smaller ones. Which would seem to be very ironic, considering that, okay, I'll say that Velvet Retaliation was a slightly larger film than Norkarchy. Consider that Norkarchy is about the same time of length as Velvet Retaliation, if not slightly longer. But it's more so of the scope and the roster that has, not so much on the running time. Now, Etna would make classical style kind of succubus, with the stirrups and pretty much everything else with that, as well as with bigger wings. So I got some inspiration from that, as well as some other ones such as Van Helsing and some others, to get the design for this iteration of Etna. This even extends to the Warner Brothers 2019 iteration of Etna. So I played around with some design bits where Etna would have like a cloth that's around her upper arms or her biceps. Then I have another one where she has these gauntlets. And there's even one where she would have these strings or chains. So I kind of had to play around with it a bit. And I also kind of debated if she would have normal feet or there would be monster-like, just like how the vampire brides would end up having in the film. Ultimately, that if you've seen her final design in the series, that wasn't much of the case here. Um, it would have been a nice design kind of go for, but that would also extend to other dragons. But it just didn't end up being materialized. The part of the idea that I was working with a lot of these characters that would be dragon-like is that they would be Promethean half-dragons, where they're human-like beings that got the DNA from their dragon predecessors, where they would have a dragon parent or like a dragon grandparent, where they would carry on their D cells, which is something similar with having G cells, except that they wouldn't be biologically Godzilla right off the bat, while they can be biologically dragon off the bat. But the G cells is a very different thing altogether, and it's often more convoluted than this. So, if she's Etna, you pretty much already know what kind of some of the Transformer characters that were initially going to appear, and some of them unfortunately didn't make it in. So Scorponok, Barricade, Breakout, or not Breakout. Yeah, I think that's Blackout. No. Yeah, that's supposed to be Blackout. And then there's Nitro Zeus. So I played around with different head designs where it's sort of a mix of Transformers Prime, a mix of 2007, some bits of, I think it's supposed to be maybe it's parts of G1 and maybe animated. And I did some for Starscream and Shockwave. Now Shockwave would get a different kind of head design in the final version, where he would have these two sharp horns instead of having these long prongs that he got from animated. Now, Nitro Zeus, when he was being concepted, I kind of had him go for more of that Last Night look, but he would have more of that monstrous look, that he has these jaws that has like those teeth coming out, which is different from how Shockwave would look like, where he just has nothing. Okay. So those are just Megatronic Etna's designs. I've also did some concepts for Kreka, Takua, and even did Roddy Tops at one point. In fact, Kreka was originally going to make an appearance in the series, but he didn't get materialized. Coincidentally, though, Bone Crusher would pretty much be exactly what Kreka was. Wait, no, that's Okmo, not Takua. No, I mean, the thing here is that both Takua and Okmo look kind of similar in terms of design, not so much on the color scheme or even the masks. And then there's some with Sub-Zero, Dingodile, and Zeta. Now, Zeta would have a very different design in the final version than what we got here. He was going to be more kind of... But we would get a cybernetic version of the character, which you'll be seeing in Godzilla Minus Human. Let's see, anything else? And there's also some concepts that I've done for Soundwave. I have been trying some different iterations for the character. Now, if you've seen the final version, it's a very different type of design from what I have been trying out. And it's definitely more kind of a darker type of look with some whites added on to that. So it's sort of a semi G1 Soundwave, but with some Transformer Prime vibes going on. Okay, and then there's Sector, which would extend to Cyrax and some of the other Lin-Kuei machines that would appear in the series, as well as in a good bulk of Akuma. And then there's Velvet Crow with another design that I tried to go for. Now, of course, in hindsight, hindsight was 2020. I was gonna go in for more kind of a villainous type of look for Velvet at the time, because she was gonna have a villain role in the series. But upon further inspection, I realized that she wasn't gonna really have as much of an impact for the series as she always had a really big impact in Tales of Berseria, but this rougher iteration was not gonna cut it pretty well, and it just wasn't a very appealing design. So, and if you've seen some of the later designs that I did of her after a while, She definitely became much more relevant and important to the series than what it was originally going to be. Okay, so there's also, this is completely irrelevant. This is for a very different project, but I tried going for a design of Flegius. I ended up salvaging it for this series in particular for a monster design, some armor designs that I've worked on for Shantae, kind of going for a warrior type of look to her. And then I end up using the Megatronic language. Now, part of the inspiration, and you might be curious as to why and how I even came up with the eye design for Shantae in the first place. So much of that came from Sailor Moon, but primarily from Sailor Mars. Now, of course, it's because, well, Shantae and Rei Hino share the same voice actress, Christina V. But part of that because I like the idea of having these white pupils in the middle of the eyes to give them more kind of a celestial look to them. Now, obviously, because genies are celestial beings or semi celestial beings that have powers, so they would obviously need to have a design choice that would give off that kind of look to them. And if you've seen the final version for Shantae in Megatronic Legacy and many others, you'll see that they have white pupils inside their eyes. Well, not to be confused with the reflections, but just the center of their eyes. Okay, and then we're back over here. I don't think there's really anything else to go over. I think that's pretty much it for 2021. Now, 2022 is going to be a lot, so I'm going to try to breeze through some of these as much as I can. So let me go ahead and get them over. So they're not going to... So I also added in some skeletal... I also added in some skeletal pieces to the design itself where he would have kind of more of a ghostly look to him or a spiritual look to him. And I also added in these tusks that are from his cheeks. And then I'm going to go ahead and skip right over here. And there's another concept of him of 2021 that would carry over to 2022. And then you have his dorsal fins that are glowing up. He has got this kind of a ghostly look to him. And here's some map designs of Mystica and Riptorix. I think it's kind of flipped over, but that doesn't matter. Okay, here's another one that's flipped to the right to the right way. And then here is some promotional concept art that I've did for what was going to be Awakening of Godzilla that ended up becoming Godzilla -3. So part of the premise was that after Norkarki was defeated, we would end up getting a story arc where Spyro, Flan, and Conquer were being notified of Godzilla arriving to Earth. And then they would have to go all the way over across the world to stop him, but then get transported into the Genie Realm. And so they would have to find a way to leave the Genie Realm to return to America to stop Godzilla. And then where Shantae and Ripto were responsible for sending Godzilla into Earth so that they can find the key to Helrix. I don't know if that's the exact same details that I have for the story itself, but much of the premise still remains the same. Okay, some character that would be the case would be Richard Nixon, and that's because he has the most screen time out of all of the characters, and this is completely irrelevant. That was for a different thing. I did kind of a small comic where Reagan, before he became governor, handed off the baby Spyro over to Flan where she would look after him. And that would pretty much be the thing for later into the series. Then we have the Shiai Ryu Crusaders, which Ryoko was originally going to be part of the team for the story of Akuma, but then she would end up being scrapped just to have Rokuro and Shantae journeying in through hell. Some concept art for Nasty Nork, and there's some for Buzz and Ripto's minions. Then I've got some for Gulp and Conquer. Okay. Here's some promotional art that I was exploring for Godzilla minus 3, which at the time it was the Awakening of Godzilla, but that became Godzilla minus 3. Here's the Fallen, or Megatronus Convoy, which originally it was just going to be called Megatronus Prime and Optimus Prime and so on and so forth, but then it changed to Convoy because, number one, that was the name for the Japanese names of the primes, and two, kind of thinking about how convoys tend to work in their own specific ways, is that they would be carrying over its cars or its members or so on and so forth. So I thought that would be a good label to use for later type of characters. Now, Velvet would end up getting a change with her design. Now, of course, I had to go through some different Velvet Retaliation and so on. Another concept of Megatronus Convoy, and there's some concepts that I've done. So there's one where Ripto was horrified by a vision of Miss Alika, and then there's one of Nibiru Unicron. There's Velvet facing up against Velvet M Jr., or we know him as Vel Vadame Jr., I would say. And then there's Spyro and Flan inside Nasty Nork's Soviet base. The Soviet base that would be in Berlin. And then we have a concept piece for President Reagan showing a footage of Godzilla attacking Russia, and then going all the way up to, or I would say attacking China and then Russia, and he would go all the way up to I think it was called the eastern part of Russia, where he would then go swimming across through the west coast, or all the way up to the northern west coast, and then, or actually before that, Spyro and his team would be informed by that, and then they would have to go over there to stop the monster. And then we would get some concept art for Cybertron and Unicron, and just kind of see how all these are spread apart. Then there's also some parts of Mystique, which the sizing of these worlds would become more finalized later down the lines. And originally I was going to have Unicron and Primus be a lot larger than what I initially had in mind, with both of them being about the size of Saturn, but I had to shrink them down just a bit to where they're pretty close to where Neptune is. So I thought it would be a reasonable size for those two, because in my past works they were super large. Like, that would have caused imbalances, which that would still be the case here, but not so much as we would end up getting. Uranus Unicron or Xenos Unicron or Xenos Unicron, you have Primum Mobile Cybertron. Okay. And there's some more Nibiru Unicron. And pretty much the same concept that I have done from the other ones, and I've also explored some ways in how I would size Mystica compared to the US states. There's some language, pretty much the same as I've already shown before, and there's a rough concept of Velvet lamenting over her dead brothers and family. And then you have the Sangheili about to attack her. Here's some more concept art of where Megatron would end up being in the end of World War II. Then you've got the Norks making a deal with the Covenant. And then you have kind of like a rough draft with what Dark Redemption was going to look like. You know, before some changes are coming, and they are going to be coming. Some concept art here with Velvet and Mogilou. Now, it's still being thought of, is that Spyro and his team were going to have kind of like a giant mech, where they would be facing up against Miss Alika in her darker form, where she would have her own mech, and then Spyro and his team would have this. Be kind of like the holier dragon mech. Now, the funny thing is, I was thinking of calling this one Sparks, because that's what was going to pretty much be, is kind of like a golden dragon robot that would be used to fight off against Miss Alika. I think it would also been cool if he gets damaged further, his colors would change based off of what Sparks would be in the video games themselves. Also, part of the design was based off of the Kiryu design from the Millennium Godzilla movies. Here's some with Velvet in her later design. Here's some more, pretty much the same as I've shown earlier, and there's some concept art of Magilu. Part of the idea that I had for Magilu is that she could use magic to kind of change her appearance, where she can just. If you've seen Sword in the Stone, where Madame Mim would use her hair just to kind of cover her face, and then it just changes to kind of like a pig face, except that Magilu would change her face to look like a Cyclops. That never got materialized, and instead she would have a crescent moon on the right side of her face. Okay, and then there's some Conquer Doll. That would not pretty much be a thing for the official series. Don't worry, there's not going to be a establishment Republican running with Conquer, so it's going to be an anti-establishment. But there's another concept piece of Spyro and Velvet. Here's some concept art for Gulp and Crush. So what I was going for, and excuse me for the noise, but because again, it's a really rough live stream, and it's just going over some of the concept art. But yeah, this was a concept art piece of Gulp and Crush. I was gonna deviate a little bit by giving them more kind of the classic look of their PS1 models, while still maintaining some aspects of their reignited look. So I do like the reignited look, but the reignited designs kind of looked more menacing and mean, and not so much as kind of like the dumb, bumbling idiot minions that would be following their leader. So I wanted to make Gulp and Crush look dumb on purpose, but there would still be a threat because of how big and strong these guys are. Because, they're brawn, but they're not really much brains. So that's what ended up being the case. So some concept art, and Eggman does not exist here, but here's one where Godzilla attacks the jets. That would pretty much be a thing in the final version of Godzilla -3. Now, a part of the design of Gen Spectre Godzilla is that he would have these jaws that would open up, and then he would start spewing out his matrix. What it was initially going to be just the atomic breath, but that ended up changing to the matrix breath, mainly because of the matrix shard that was being used to create the Godzilla clone in the final version. Alright, and then some designs of Optimus Prime, or what ended up becoming Optimus Convoy. Then there's Velvet. Here's Princess Diatra. That hasn't been materialized yet, but I'm hoping to eventually get her to appear at some point, maybe as a cameo for a Vietnam War hero. She was originally an accomplice or ally to Miss Aleka in the Mortal Brothers 2019 timeline. That would end up changing in this continuity. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing how I'm able to work with that. And I'm probably going to be doing some changes with the character in question. But that's still up in the air if that's going to end up being the case. There's going to be some changes as I go along. And then there's Luminous Magnus, which in retrospect, this is supposed to be a successor to Seraph Lamington or Christo from Disgaea 5. So if you're familiar with Disgaea 1 and Disgaea 5, spoilers, Christo and Lamington are the same character. It's just that Disgaea 5 was a prequel to Disgaea 1, which takes place thousands of years before then, and it's what ended up being the case is where he would have some green hair as well as some of the silver hair, which would pretty much be kind of a similar deal as to how we would get in... I mean, ideally, that's how we would get in the official Disgaea canon, but they both have slightly different character designs, so... maybe in the future, but... Then he would become a probe, or kind of like a drone, later down the lines. Here's Raditops. So initially she was going to make it into the series, but I did away with some of the zombie designs, so... she just wasn't going to be the case. And that was a design from 2021. So some could have like a smaller role in the series, or maybe like one of the smaller androids that would appear. but that never ended up being materialized. Now the funny thing is that I did a newer design of Laphicet, but he would be in the form of Bumblebee or B-127. That would be discussed later down the lines in part two this year, but that's where it is. So I hope you found a good chunk of the retrospective interesting so far. I'm gonna go take a break real quick, and I'll be right back. Would pretty much be the only one to make it. Would pretty much be the only one to make it through afterwards. So yeah, I know OBS. I know you are trying to reconnect, and it's my computer's Wi-Fi connector. It's just not doing well. If it was my laptop, then we would be able to get through without any issue. It's just that my Wi-Fi connector is just not the best. Anyway, here's something I wanted to show. So I did some design work for Vuborak. So what I was kind of exploring for Vuborak is that he's going to have more of the Omega, Sonic Omega type of character, and that he was going to have some design bits that would sort of resemble Omega, but it would still be resemblant to that of his original Bionicle Combiner design, because he's got 4 arms, and he would have um, big bulky legs, and that he would have a design face that would be somewhat resemblant to his design or to his set design, but he would be wearing some kind of a mask that he doesn't even move his mouth, but it would just be kind of an electronic design look to that, and he would have his hairpin. So that was kind of the idea and how I wanted to design Voparak. Now, I kind of joked that he was kind of too short for a combiner, but it was still a pretty solid set. I just didn't have as much of an interest in the set when I first tried it out as I do now. It's actually a very solid combiner design, and I wanted to implement some bits of the design into this version. Now, of course, he would end up being slightly smaller than most of the Bionicle sets, or Bionicle characters that would end up appearing. And of course, you have Takua on the side here. Pretty self-explanatory based on how I design him. So there's that. And I've also Diatra, and pretty much a good bulk of the Genie characters for that matter. But I haven't modeled these yet. I don't know if I'm going to. At least for one of them I will, but the rest of them I just haven't got to. Now, most of these character designs would still be from 2021, but I would end up finalizing at least 1 or 2 of them, and that would be Okmu. So I'm basing off of his Metro design, where he would look benevolent at first, but if y'all know who Okmu is, he is far from benevolent. He is one of the biggest bastards in the Bionicle universe. The only difference is that Pterodex would know exactly what he is doing, and he would be smart enough on how to run the universe. Okmu would have just run the universe to the ground. Straight up, he would have, and he would do much the same in Megatronic Legacy. Kuika Shantae's mother, I toyed around with some coloration on her design. Now the funny thing is that I initially wanted both her vest and her cape to have a blue color, which is pretty much the same as it was from her Warner Brothers 2019 design. But after doing a commissioned art with Omeza with the character in question, her vest ended up being not. Actually, no. Her vest would end up being blue, but her waist cape would be black. So I still gave that same courtesy as I have with a lot of artists that did their commission work, where I have to make the changes based off of what I did with their commission work. Same thing with Paraka, pretty much the same as how they looked from another scan. Some concept art for Angela. Can't even see some of the concept art, so I think that's. I want to see if there's any more left from it. Hold on. I think I could maybe just. Yeah, I can skip over here. Some concept art of some of the battle scenes here. Here's a concept art for the Zyklek. Now, unlike the Bionicle Zyklek I'm seeing in Bionicle series, they would be a lot less intelligent and they would be more like animals. And in a way, there would be biomechanical experiments being carried over from dinosaurs and Godzilla himself and the Godzillasaur. So they're kind of like the offsprings to Godzilla in a way. Originally, I was going to have them be more like the ancestors to Godzilla, but after going through some changes, they would just be offsprings or successors to Godzilla in a way. They would be artificial successors to Godzilla, but nevertheless. Here's some concept art for some of the politicians: Nixon, Senator Biden, and Governor Clinton. Here's some concept art for some of the other scenes. Some are widescreen and some are just kind of portrait. And then here's another one for the Zyklek with the color testing. And here's a final version for Metalhead where it would be closer to the reignited Metalhead, but some parts of it would be carried over from the PS1 as well as some new bits that I tried out. Here's some concept art for Dark Redemption. None of that has been finalized, but I was kind of going for having Velvet being on the dark side and then Flan being on the light side, even though Velvet would end up being a hero in Dark Redemption, but it's kind of more of an advertising purpose. And I did some more experimenting with the Megatronic language. And then here's one that I want to showcase. Megatron. So the big guy himself. I did some experimenting with the Armada, then the animated G1, pretty much everything that we would know from him in Love and Loathe. And I also did some other series design pieces, such as the Bionicle Toa foot that I added in for Megatron. And I think that's pretty much all that I added in for his design right here. I was initially going to add a Imperial Japanese design where it would be more sense, or it would make more sense with how I'm going to animate the character. And then here's some more concept scenes. Princess Zapple. That never ended up being the case here. And then here's some scene designs here and there. In fact, I want to showcase this one scene right here where this is going to be Megatron's convoy who escapes Yal Helrix. He would have kind of a mixture of light and dark energon. It's sort of like a energon fusion in a way, where he would be mixing in light and dark, and then that would pretty much be there and that. And then there's Ranger Nixon, which of course with Megatronus, that doesn't end up being the case now because, well, if you see Neighbor Crisis Lithium, he's already been defeated. And then here's a timeline of Buzz Lightyear becoming Master Lightyear in the later years. And then we would have the Shiai Ryu members and Magilu gathering together in the Starlight area where Godzilla crosses through. And then you have Megatron's portrait right here. I keep right clicking for some reason. Here's some bits for Deadwing's weapon. Here's some concept art of Flawn as well as with President Nixon. Here's some concept art that I did for the Tri-Junction Domains factions or the tribes. And then here's a portrait of Etna. Here's some with Spyro and Velvet. I wasn't even sure what this was going to be. I thought I had something in mind for this, but I didn't even come back to finishing that one. And then you have these that I was doing for one of the characters. So I can't remember what it was Kame. I think that was the name of that character in question. But she would be one of the Shira members who joined Shantae against Rokuro and his team. And so I played around with design for a bit and how this character was going to look, and I had to simplify that just enough to where it would be easy to animate in Blender. She only got one appearance, and that's Nibiru Crisis 2. That's going to change, of course, once I get to Dark Redemption, but yeah. And then here you have it with the Etna and her team in the later years, where she becomes a leader for the Misilikan faction after Misilika dies. And then I've been playing around with some of the facial expressions of Etna, because of course Etna is really fun to play with in the concept art. And I did some expression testing for Spyro, Conqueror, and Nasty Nork. I got some inspiration from that villain. I can't remember what his name was, but he's definitely from Space Ace, where he just kind of has this grotesque, ugly look to his face, but it's just so expressive, where he's able to just kind of move his lips around, and then he just has these eyebrows. He's a lot of fun to look at in the game. And I tried to do something similar with Nasty Nork in a sense, where I try to give him kind of more of that grotesque, ugly look to the character, which was the point of Nasty Nork. He looks nasty. I mean, yeah, because he's simple, not much of a threat, and he's ugly, and that's what pretty much set him off in PS1. A design that I tried to do for Rokuro and ended up, or Ryoko, I would say, and then, while I did a model for the design itself, that never appeared in the films. And then a design for Unicron, where he's going to have his own smaller body. A model that was already created, but not shown in the films. So I did some iterations for some of the Promethean presidents that would end up running in the 90s and 2000s. And I've already did a final art piece for Altis and Celica, or I think that's supposed to be her name, Celica? Or Sierma, I'm sorry, but Sierma. They would have their own presidential arc. It's kind of undecided. A concept art piece of Misilika and Senator Biden. That's probably not going to happen in the final version, as I was kind of thinking of at first, but it's still kind of a similar plot line. It's just a different character. And here's a scanned version for the I can't remember what that was, but it was supposed to be one where Velvet would end up getting some kind of reconciliation and then gets a new chapter in life. So that one's already finalized. This one is a similar concept from earlier, but it's just added color for color testing. Here's Velvet and Flawn. And then there's kind of a altar where it's a tribute to the Unholy Alliance in the Midgrandian War, where the Paraka, the Zerg's Federation, and Misilika would pretty much be sort of like the Axis powers, where you have the Nazis and you have the Italian fascists and the Imperial Japan, where they would kind of have an unnatural alliance, if I'm putting it very lightly, is that they would end up being an alliance against their specified enemies in the Second World War. Primarily against the Soviet Union, but they would also be against other factions in the Second World War later down the lines. Then there's a scanned photo of the Nibiru Crisis promotion And then there's one for Kami Phasma Part 2. Some concept art for Magilu that never end up being materialized. Here's some weapons that were going to be used for Misalika's weapons, such as the Elder Rifle, and then there's the Devil Spiker, which would be the Needler. So some Covenant weapons would end up being a thing for Misalika's faction, while there are some, a good bulk of them would still go to the Covenant. And then there's a Japanese version that I tried to do of Norgarchy, which would be Spyro power against or battle against communists. It's a bit of a sillier, goofier look compared to the American version that I did, but it was still fun to do. And then there's it's kind of like a retrospect from Great Unicron Legacy to Megatronic Legacy. How different they are, how similar they are, so on and so forth. And there's Megatron with the ultimate power. And then there's go ahead and take a look at something real quick. But this is supposed to be a synthetic energon chasm, or kind of like a chamber where they would preserve all the synthetic energon that they gather that they're going to use for war and stuff like that. I'll go ahead and go over here. There's some scans of Diatra as well as Zactan picking a piece of synthetic energon in front of Etna. And then there's Etna with the Misalikan chamber. And here's all the emojis that I've been kind of playing around with. Now, some of them would end up being scrapped. There's Koika eating a piece of chocolate cake, and there's Harmony, there's Vera, and then there's Nasty Nork kind of giving that look to that. Now, the Spyro Smile that we would end up seeing here, that's pretty much a thing in my Discord server, as well as with the Shantae wow type of emoji. All right, and there's also a photo. So I'm gonna try to go for a little longer, maybe all the way up until 2:30, maybe 3 o'clock. But here's some concept art of Etna, or just kind of like a sketch drawing of Etna. And then there's one kind of a similar retrospective that I tried to get into, but I haven't got around to that. In some cases, I kind of got around to that. It's just not the same as I thought of initially. And then there's a black and white coloring of Ryoko in this outfit. And then here's one of Etna. Here's another one of Etna's team. Right here. I haven't got around to even finalizing this drawing in particular. I want to, but I don't know if I'm going to get around to that. Here's some concept art of the Jackals in different outfits. Now, of course, they would get different color schemes, so a good bulk of their design pieces would remain the same, though. But the color schemes would be different. Here's some grunt concepts as well as the Hunter, which would end up becoming a Berserker, who would end up appearing in Neighborhood Crisis 2. Here's Etna in the sketch form that would end up being finalized in the digital version. Here's another iteration of, or another drawing of Etna. Here's one for Velvet inside a Covenant chamber. Now here is the progressive Fallout cover where you have Flan at the top and you have Etna at the bottom. Now I can't even say for sure if that ends up being the case in the final version, because it's been a while since I've drawn that, but this is where Etna would look down in a pool, and then we would see Flan inside that pool. So kind of like a parallel opposites between Flan and Etna. And then there's Etna, a deal to Velvet joining in with the Misalikan Union. And then there's Velvet alongside the Shogun Titan himself. Not relevant to the project itself, but there's Nasty Nork in his portrait without his helmet. Another sketch of Velvet. That's the same. And then there's kind of like a future design with what Velvet was going to look like.
Now, a lot of design changes are going to be coming in as the series comes to a close. Here's the Halo Ring Factory maps where I've explored different type of mapping and where the continents are going to be located. And then I have a sketch of Etna and Spyro fighting in Mystica. And then there's Mikai Rankash in his pose. There's him fighting against Ryoko in the Middle East. And then there's Ryoko in the same location, just lounging. Here's some more concept of Velvet. Here's a concept art that I tried getting into for Velvet and Spyro in Mystica, but that never ended up being finalized. They would be the protagonist for the final Dark Redemption arc, where they would travel across Mystica to overthrow Mesolika and just stopping her from invading America and others. Some weapon design bits that I've been kind of working on would be heavily based off of the Sega controllers. Here's that. There's a portrait of Senator Zurg. Funny thing is that I would end up making a updated drawing with Super Zurg being in this place, and that would actually be finalized, and this one wouldn't. Here's a concept piece of Nibiru Unicron invading the Trijunction domain that would end up being finalized in the final version, and there's another sketch of Unicron in space. And then there's Terrador, so Shepard Terrador, which has always been hinted at and discussed in films in the series. He would pretty much be like this acclaimed savior and shepherd of the Dragon Empire, who also ended the Migrandian War. And here's Miss Ilinka. If she had a more modest design of the character in question, where she would have a skirt and then she would have some more armor added to her arms and have a different spear design. So here are some Sangheili design armor that I have done. Now, most of which ended up being finalized and would be carried over in the animation process. Some of it may not be as much. Here's some weapon designs that I've done. So some of them would be for Mesolika, but most of them would go for the Covenant. Some of them are for the dragons. And then there's more weapons here. Here is a Nibiru Crisis 2 promotion, which at the time it was going to be the birth of Godzilla, but now that ended up being Nibiru Crisis 2. Some concept art of Etna. Here's a piece of Velvet that goes from different phases where she used to be in the darker phase and is now in the lighter phase. And now here's the American version of what Norkarki's promotion art was going to be. And I think that was taken in... I want to go ahead and take a look real quick when that was... Go ahead and get this out of here. I want to check in properties to see when that was taken. So I'm certain that it was taken in... I think it was... Yeah, July of 2023. So this... This is where the development for Norkarki started, is where it would be Spyro and Flan journeying into Berlin in the Soviet Union and putting a stop to Nasty Nork's attempt to crystallize the Earth with a bomb that would just cover up the entire planet. And that would create a lifetime of energy for the Norks to sustain with. And then there's another sketch of Etna. That would pretty much be the same as it was before, but it's just black and white. Here's some concept pieces. Pretty much the same as I had from the other sketches. I think that's pretty much all that I have. So that was pretty much it for the 2023 sketch art. That would be a much shorter line. So before we proceed any further, the next time I wanted to start showing off the stuff that would be from 24 to 26. Before we close that up, I want to show some progress work that I've done for the models. So it's not going to be all of them, but I want to showcase some model work that I've done.
No, that's not what I want to do. I don't want to look at properties. I just want to open in a new window.
Okay, there we go.
All right, let me see here. I want to make sure if I change that to date.
It's gonna take a bit for it to get through, but I want to showcase some of the model progress that's from 21 to 23. The first character model that I've done was Spyro. Now, he would not be the first one to get completed, but I did get to work on the character in question. So, I'll go ahead and just kind of make sure if I got this through. Alright. So here's some model work that I've done for Spyro. This is how it all started out. I was blocking out some bits of his design and kind of seeing where this all gets through. And this was from September 19th of 2021. Not that in particular. Sorry. This is where I would end up adding in materials to. So some more work here and there. Added in the spikes on his body. And then developing him further, I added in his wings. Now, of course, the wings were too big when developing his design sets here and there. And then I would eventually shrink his wings to where they're reasonably sizable. And then there are his eyes. I did not add it in the skeletal weight paint to it. At least not at the time yet. And then here's Spyro with the way that his face is structured. Of course, now this red part right here in the blue. So how this works is the face orientation. So anything that is blue when looking at face orientations is the correct light orientation. But when it's set to red, it's either not going to show up in the renders, which oddly enough, it did show it for Barack at least, or it would just not show up properly. And then I would do some testing with Spyro with how he's going to look. And then there's Nasty Nork. I'll get to that later. Okay, there is Spyro in the solid view. Now let's get into Nasty Nork. And so Nasty Nork would have a similar development based off of what I was working with Spyro. Now, initially, Nasty Nork was going to have these big eyes, but then I had to shrink them up to kind of match with the design I was going for at the time. Now, similar to what I had with Spyro, I started rigging process was going to be. So I had to make some changes with how the character was going to look as well as how he's going to be animated. And there's some screenshots of his model. There's his mouth. And there's him with the PogChamp pose. And then there's Spyro. And then there's Nasty Nork without the loincloth. That ended up being easier to animate with when he's out in battle. And there's how he's going to look in terms of sizing. Sorry, my mouth kind of ran out for a bit. There was going to be a human design for Flan and many others, but I was just not much of a fan with how the human bodies were going to look with this model. So I ended up with the Shantae design, as you're about to see later. Here's some progress work on Godzilla. Now, I had to do some sculpting with a good bulk of his body and how they're going to look. And then I would have to remesh it to where it would be reasonable enough to animate with in the final look. Now, going for Conquer for a bit, I kind of go through a similar process of what I did with Spyro and Nasty Nork. Also giving him the texture paint. Here's Godzilla. Godzilla has been finalized, but he would end up getting a lower res look where it's easier to animate with. And then there's Spyro with his expressions. There's Godzilla. Also use this to kind of work on a 2D version of the the cover that I tried to do. And then there's some Conquer. Here's some Godzilla. And then I started doing some model work of Shockwave, the character models that I've done back in 2020. Now the thing is that character models that I've done back in 2020. Now the thing is that I had to redo some bits of this design to where it would look good for this design. So I added some texture paint to the eyes. I had to do some texture paint for the body as well. I initially had textures added on to the gauntlets as well, much of which wasn't going to be the case in the final version in Akuma that you have seen. And then there's Hanzo Hisashi as a sword. He pretty much stays the same as it was from 2022, but yeah, this is the early version of Shantae when I tried designing it, and it did not look very good at all when designing it. Now this version definitely looks a lot better with the way that I have set up the texture paint, as well as how I've designed the model. Now, it would definitely look a lot better in the later versions. There's Spyro with an updated look to him where his wings have been sized down to where it would make sense. I'm going to skip over some of the stuff. That's just skipping over some stuff. Here's Flan. I did some work on Flan over here. Initially, she was going to have fabric textures, which ended up being the case in Norkarki. Not so much in the later versions, because they would be proven to be more difficult to work with when modeling them, or animating them, I should say. Going here to Nasty Nork. So here's a final version of Nasty Nork. Here's his sickle and his hammer. I'm going to see if I can try to stop at... Where would that be? I'm going to try to stop at... I mean, depending on where I got to 2024. Okay. No, that would be... Trying to find a spot to where I could stop at 23. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and continue on. So here's the sickle and here's Flan. Some render shots that I've done. This one is close to what I did with the 2D version. Maybe not quite as much, but that would pretty much come close to being the case. So I based off of this render from the 2D illustration where Spyro and Flan would infiltrate inside a base in Berlin. So this one's a little bit closer. And then there's Conquer. He was already finished. Go ahead and skip over some of the designs over here. And then there's Godzilla. I did some work on how he was going to be set up and posed. Here's him in the back. And then the next one is Etna, which I ended up doing an initial design of Etna without the lipstick. And here's her weapons and the character herself. And there's the grenade that she was going to use, that she only used once in Velvet Retaliation. And there's her with the spear. And then throwing the grenade. Then here's her Elder rifle, which initially Etna was going to have the spear, which in fact the Elder Spear was the rifle that Etna was going to have in the Disgaea games, and she had always had the case. But that changed to having like a sniper rifle. They could change the size of the character himself. That would pretty much just be the official height for the characters in question. So, fun thing about Mekai is that when designing him, GG had his design where he would be a mix of blues and greens and reds and some of the different color designs that he has. I kind of had to streamline that to kind of having cooler colors, maybe with the exception of yellow, but that's just because he had the color of yellow for his yellow for his hair color. But much of that would pretty much be primarily be cool colors. Okay, so here he is. Here's Mekai Rankash. And I think I've did some renders of him with Etna. Okay, so see how far I can go. So Dr. Shimp would have kind of a slightly more overweight look to his design as opposed to Nasanork that looks more compacted. But he would be shorter and would have a more a witch doctor type of design look to him. And it would be closer to his classic look. But it would just have a more updated look to him. And he would look similar to Nasanork in terms of body, and that's him without the glasses. Be glad that you don't see him looking like that in the final version. So there's that. And there's his staff. Let's see how far I am into it. Okay, so there's some ways that we're going off of it. So this is what the roster was going to be. Hold on. Sorry. Okay, so hopefully we should be caught up now. Now, here are some earlier renders for Velvet. Now, this was a bit of a challenge when doing this, because some of that would just kind of go through some of the meshes that I did at the time. But that wouldn't be so much of the case in her later versions. And then there's her using the orb to create these spears. And there's her machete that she would use initially. Here's her without the cape, and there's one with the cape. So there's that for Velvet. And then there's Metalhead. So not really much to say about this. And then there's Talatia. Did some work on the characters blocking out and trying to get it to match with the design that I came up with for the character in question. Don't know if I think there is some more about him later down the lines, but we'll get to them eventually. There's a screenshot of Godzilla with the just with the high res look to him before I got to remeshing him. Now we get to Talatia. So did some further adjustments with his set pieces. There's Unicron. I'm going to skip over him. There's Talatia once again. Did some color testing. And then I would end up doing some more work on the character. And there's him before I got to finalize the design in question. I think that's pretty much what I would end up having for his design. And that's him without his helmet. There's him with his helmet. Just kind of going down further. And there's Magnus. So I did some work on Magnus to kind of match with his reignited look and kind of getting to his classic look. I don't know if we would end up getting more just to kind of see him. Maybe we will eventually. I just had to base it off of the date modified or when these were created. So bear with me on this. There's Primus Spark. And then there's a Chamber of Primus. That never ended up being shown in the final versions for the films. That could pretty much be a thing in the future, but that's just what it is for now. Then there's Magnus. Did some color testing. So I don't know if I base it off of his PS1 color scheme, but I definitely got some design bits off of the reignited look to him. It's definitely more relaxed and limited in comparison, but the color scheme I did get more from the PS1 version, but maybe some from reignited as well. It's just that it's less orange here. And there he is with his final version. And then there's Nestor. So there he is. Now there's Delvedam Jr. And there's Buzz Lightyear, but I'm just kind of jumbling through all over the place. And then there's some for Bubba, the blue dragon from Beastmakers. And then back to Delvedam Jr. once again. And then there's Senator Zurg, the evil Senator Zurg, I should say. Even though in the series canon, he's not as evil as his previous iterations were. But I think I may have included this at one point, but I don't know if I really utilized it that much. But there he is with some of the renders that I've done for Zurg. Definitely gave him some expressions to work with. That's kind of funny, though, because he has been cyberized. Maybe he kind of has the Cybertronian material that allows him to be as such. That was never really even addressed in the... And then the lights would be yellow. Then there's some more renders here and there. Skipping a bit more. Let's see, where would that be? Okay, we're getting closer to Ryoko. Going for kind of the samurai look to the character. I would end up dropping the fabric textures ultimately, because it would be easier to animate with. And then there's her sword. I did some work on President Nixon when designing him. It would be mostly based off of his 1983 look, which is kind of funny because his model would still be used in the earlier phases of the series. There's him with the back. And then there's some work on Shipmaster. There's I think, yeah, that's Okmo. Okay, so there's Okmo. Did some work on him. And then there's kind of like a rendered version for how he's plotting. And there's his preview of what he looks. Then there's Takua with his shield that we never ended up seeing in the final version of the films. I don't know if I did include it, but that's not too much of a big problem. And then there's the beach version for Velvet, which she would end up getting a version where she wears the pants in the final version. And then there's some blocking out for Raydak. And then there he is. He was the first one to... And then there's Avok. I was going to say Hatgan. We already got to see Avok. Or Hatgan, I should say. Anyway. And there's Avok with a shotgun. And then there's the shotgun that was only ever used in one scene in Call Me Phasma Part 2 when Verbrat got freed and he started killing off about half of the Paraka. And then there's Zaktan. There he is. Just kind of looking through the character's design a bit. He was gonna have more kind of like an X-Men kind of design, where specifically Wolverine, where he would have these claws added on to his fists, and they're just kind of clawing through and just tearing stuff apart. Gonna go ahead and skip over a bit. Then I got to work on Grimoire and Magilu. Although I always only have worked on Grimoire initially, I don't know if I did Magilu. Maybe at some point I'll show off, but here's another design of Ryoko with a casual form. Arguably, I don't know, it may be a little bit more modest, but again, that design never really materialized. But maybe at some point we'll get to see that. So here's President Reagan. I did a model of the character. Here's Senator Biden. We only got to see him in Godzilla -3. Here's President Carter. We never even got to see him in any of the films. Then we skip over to Miss Eleka. Now here's her front and back views. We would get later versions of the models themselves, where both Etna and Miss Eleka would get the lipsticks for their faces. A lot of the character models would end up having these extra meshes to their eyes. The idea for those being a thing is that eye shrink, but that never ended up being a thing and just ended up making eye textures instead. Now here's one of the Soviet leaders, Yuri Andropov. Yeah, I think that's what his name was going to be. Correct me if I got that pronunciation wrong, but he did appear in Norkarchy as well as in a part of Megaterra in the epilogues, in the end credit scene. And then there's George Bush, the guy that raised taxes, unfortunately. But then we get to Magilu. So I got to do some work on Magilu on how her design was going to look with the skirt and with the sleeves and pretty much everything here and there. So it would still pretty much be we would end up seeing it in Nibiru Crisis Lithium, where she would have this initial design. She would have another design that was a thing back in 25 with Nibiru Crisis 2. This is the one that she would end up having. And then this is the crescent moon eye that I was talking about earlier that was finalized. And there's Diatra, who never got to appear in any of the films. That could be a thing in the future, but... Alright, so now another OC that would appear in the films, or at least for now, we would have her appear in Afida and Neighbor Crisis 2. Okay. And then there's pretty much that for her. And then we would get John F. Kennedy, who only appeared once in Neighbor Crisis 1. Which is kind of unfortunate that he had to go off the way it did. And then another Soviet leader, I can't exactly remember what it was, but he definitely was the leader before Yuri Andropov. But yeah, he would appear in that as well. Then we have Duncan Carterson or Buzz Lightyear as a soldier before he got drafted off as a space ranger. Speaking of Buzz, this is where he would become a space ranger and was sent off outside of space to face an alien encounter in 1962. I carried over a good bulk of the color schemes from the Toy Story version that we would have. Okay. I did get to work on Soundwave for a bit, and I would get it based off of the Transformers Prime look of the character, with some of that being his G1, and I don't know if it was... Maybe that was a part of Bayverse design. And then there he is with his final version. There's Shockwave, that's already been finalized. And then there's some render shots of Etna. Okay. And then there's Unicron, who would have his Sankili form, kind of like a smaller build of the character. And then there's Nixon, who is going to have his Space Ranger form. That would pretty much still be a thing for Dark Redemption once I get to that. There's General Eisenhower. There's also Ripto. I would end up finalizing the design. I would have to end up dropping the textures for his cape. That would be easier to be able to render and also to animate with. And he's also up to scale with Spyro this time, instead of being bigger than Spyro. Just a little bit taller, but not quite as big. So that would be pretty much at the same height. Then I would end up getting to designing Megatron. I had to use a model of Ryoko in this phase just so that I can get with to scale and how the characters would look. Nancy Reagan, I'll just skip over that. And I'll also have General Eisenhower. Then bouncing back to Megatron. So this is what he was going to look like initially, just kind of testing out some textures here and there. And then here he is with the final version of the character in question. And then some designs here and there. This is where I would end up starting the development of Norkarchy, and this is the first film that I would end up mentioning, or probably the only one that I would mention in this progress work. So I had to do some progress work as far as to how the textures are going to look for the scenes, and how the characters are going to be showing up in the scenes that I'll be working with. Here's him, as well as one of the early Nork characters that are in the frames, or the picture frames, I should say. I also did kind of an illusion of disbelief kind of look for how the hallways are going to look, instead of it just kind of extending outwards. And then you have President Conquer. That hasn't been decided yet, but I'm very much leaning to wanting to have Conquer appear as a president in a future film series. And then here's Conquer kind of taking issue with George Bush. If there were ever end up being the case where Bush was still president and then Conquer would have to step up to being kind of like a reform president, then that would actually be a pretty interesting story arc on itself. There's also a Soviet Nork. There's another render of Nasty Nork. And there is where he puts the super crystal bomb inside his chamber, where he would start crystallizing Earth. And then there's Spyro and Flan about to prepare to enter the chamber. I don't think I have started animation on that segment yet, but there is Nasty Nork preparing to set up the crystallization on Earth. I did some work on the Oval Office. There's the Halo rings with their different mappings and all that. I think at least 2 of them got to have relevance in the storyline and appearance in the storyline. And then we have a Sankili in Elite. There's the plasma rifle. There's the Red Elite. Okay. Just making sure that it's able to fit through. And then there's an Oval Office once again. Just kind of testing out how the placement of the objects and the sizing would look. I only had to do just a handful of objects in the Oval Office. And then we get to some locations in Berlin and some parts of the Soviet Union where Spyro and Flan would try to infiltrate the camp. Okay, here's Nasty Nork with the Norkarchy emblem and the statues. Okay, and then I had to work on adding in a sun at the background with a mesh. And then there's the camp that Dr. Shemp is in control of. Yeah. And then he gets to talk to Nasty Nork through the communication device. And there's a Berlin Wall where they separate out from one part of the continent and or part of the location, and then another to the Soviet Union. And then there's some work on the Berlin Wall. It's a really large map. Of course, that keeps connected. But anyway. Then here's Nibiru Unicron, where I've been doing some more work on the guy himself. I had to do some remeshes just to make sure that I'm able to animate the character well enough. Interesting thing, though, that I want to note is that I had to do some texture work that would allow the lighting for these effects on the planet version to be able to glow. And I've been able to find some ways in how I can make that work, and that pretty much ended up being exactly that. And then here's a render of Nibiru Unicron with, and that also ended up being used for the thumbnail of Norkarchy's pilot video. And then here's one for the Oval Office. Here's some parts of the hideout for the Soviet Norks. Okay, there's a Soviet Nork and some weapons. And then there it is with one of the scenes that appeared in the film. So there's a lot of the GK-47 rifles, and then there's the pistols, or the Nork revolvers, as they're being called. Here's the training room where the Norks are going to be visiting in. And then I think this is supposed to be the Delaware North Shores, where the heroes would end up fleeing to after they defeated the Norkarchy. That only appeared like in one segment of episode 5, I think that was. And then we would end up getting a render of Nibiru Unicron. Then we would get the La Mesa Beach, where Sparrow and Flan would relax in at the end of Norgarchy. Then there's some work on Master Lightyear. His model has already been done, but that never got to be shown in the other films. That's because this is after Dark Redemption. So we're not going to be seeing him for a while. Here's some work on the Norks, some work on Master Lightyear. Okay. There's Master Lightyear himself. And then there's some work on the Norks themselves. There's a bigger version of the Soviet Nork. And there's some Unicron armored Norks. Here's the flying elites. And if you've played, let's say, Halo 2, you would be seeing elites that would be flying. And there's also a greater amount of them in Halo Reach. Then there's some more Norks. And then there's President Reagan with Nixon meeting in this shot right here. There's also one with the characters meeting President Reagan for the scene of Norgarchy. Of Commune Phasma had these statues where they would pretty much tell you how things are being told through the storyline. That never ended up being the case for the films going forward. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case for Vietnam War Hero or Dark Redemption. That could be a thing, but that's just a possibility. And then we're going to end up getting close to finishing up by showing some renders of Godzilla with the Dark Team. And then we end up here with one shot for Velvet Retaliation. And that's pretty much it for anything that is between 21 to 2023. So I will be showcasing some more stuff for 24 to 2026 sometime later in the summer. That's pretty much it for this live stream. So if y'all have any questions, feel free to show up. I'm just going to take one quick break and then I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. So I want to go ahead and just kind of finish off by let me see. Hold on. That's pretty much all I have to showcase. So, any questions before I end this off for today? If not, then I guess we'll go ahead and just kind of end it off right here and now. So I want to thank you guys for tuning in and checking out the live stream on my retrospective on Megatronic Legacy. It's definitely been an interesting progress that I've done back in the earlier years before getting into 2024. There's definitely going to be some to go over as we get into part 2. Probably on, I want to say, yeah, you're welcome. I want to say sometime between maybe July or August if I'm able to get to that point, because I'm going to be doing Dark Redemption around the summer. But that's pretty much all I got to show. So thank you all for tuning in, and I'll be doing part 2 in the future. Take care.